Mr. Green in the conservatory with a candlestick. You guys all know those words, right? If you're here for this lecture, there's a good chance that you not only got that reference, but you also know the thrill of either reading a book or watching a movie that opens in some gentle, calm atmosphere, say a train or an English village or a large house where a group of people have come to stay for a nice, relaxing weekend, only to have that peace shattered by a scream such as, "Murder! Murder in the library!" Somehow, we have managed to turn murder, the most horrific thing that can happen to a person, a family, a community, we've turned it into a form of entertainment that gives its audience thrills while at the same time making them feel quite safe and cozy. Think about all the people who love murder mysteries who talk about curling up with a good book and a cup of tea and a nice warm blanket and a murder. Some people even argue that such stories make light of this very serious thing, that they desensitize their readers to the horrors of the world we live in. Some even feel that those who follow Christ should avoid engaging such stories, focusing instead on, as Paul tells us to do, only what is, we should focus instead on, as Paul tells us, only what is good, only what is right, only what is pure. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on one particular type of mystery, the type of mystery that became really popular in the 1930s and 40s during what's called the Golden Age of Mystery. And it's still really popular today. But I'm also going to suggest, as we're looking at those kinds of mysteries, that when we're engaging those stories, we are well within the bounds of focusing on what is pure and good and true. I'm going to suggest that not only is it okay for those who belong to Christ to read or watch those sorts of stories, but that far from being detrimental, such stories can, they don't always, but they can both edify their readers and provide support for living out the life that Christ calls his people to. So I'm going to share, if I remember how to do this. I do this every week. I don't know why I can't. Give me a minute here. Sorry, folks. That was not what I meant. There we go. I'm going to share a slideshow while I'm doing this. So apologies if there are technical difficulties, as you'll see. Anyway, we're going to do this by first defining the mystery genre. Then we're going to discuss a few points about the genre. And then finally, we're going to look closer at three of the most important people in the history of the genre. They lived at that time period when I mentioned it. They wrote at the time period I mentioned it, before and after it. Amazing how that happens. We're going to think about, with those three people, the role that faith plays in their work. So first, what, you may ask, is a mystery? Well, mysteries are stories in which the reader's blood is first curdled by some horrible and apparently inexplicable murder. The machinery of detection is then brought in to solve the mystery and punish the murderer. Well, good, great definition, but since detection is sometimes part of the title, or what people call these books, they're called murder mysteries, sometimes they're called detective mysteries, that definition doesn't help a whole lot. If you look it up online, you will find other similar definitions. So what we're going to do instead is look a little bit at maybe the history of this genre and see if we can figure this out. So Dorothy Sayers, in the introduction to An Omnibus of Crime, which you saw the picture of it just on the other slide, it was published in 1929, the height of what is now called the Golden Age of Mystery. She says that the genre is really quite old, and the very earliest mystery stories appear long ago, and they show up in different types of stories. They're not called mysteries at the time, but they're stories of other kinds that have elements of what we now call mystery. One of the most recognizable motifs of mystery even shows up all the way back in an Aesop's fable. The fable is The Lion and the Fox. So a lion has invited all these animals to come and visit him. He lives in a cave. "Why don't you come visit me in my cave?" says the lion to all the other animals. And one day he has a conversation with an animal that has not come to visit him yet. He says to the fox, "Well, why haven't you come?" to my place. Come, I've been inviting everyone. And the fox says, well, meaning no disrespect, but every time I see footprints that go into your cave, I never see those footprints come back out unless they're your own. When I see the footprints of the horses and the rabbits and the other animals that have gone into the cave, when I see those footprints come back out, then I will come in and visit you. Never says exactly what's happening. The reader should get what's going on there. But what is the clue that helps us draw the conclusion about what's happening? Murder. The clue is footprints. One of the most recognizable clues in the history of the genre of mystery. Dorothy Sayers goes on to explain that there are other ancient stories that have hints and clues and parts of mystery genre. The oldest story that she says is actually a mystery story comes from the Apocrypha. In the Apocrypha, there's a few extra chapters from the book of Daniel. One of these, chapter 14 of Daniel in the Septuagint, is published in the Apocrypha as Bel and the Dragon. Now, we don't have time for me to go through that whole story for you because it's long, but it's a lot of fun. And if you've never read it, you need to. But basically, in the story, Daniel's going to be executed because he is not worshiping the false god Bel. Does that part of the story sound familiar? That happens to Daniel a lot, apparently, and his friends. Bel every night magically eats the food that has been put into his temple the day before. Clearly, this is evidence of a god who shows up and eats, and he's a real god. Daniel says to the king, I'm going to prove to you that Bel is not eating that food. And I'm not going to give you the solution completely, but I will tell you this. What ends up saving Daniel's life is, again, footprints. He uses logic and reasoning and the ever ubiquitous footprints not only to solve the mystery, but to save his own life. In this story, however, a murder has been prevented by following the clues. So, while Sayers in the omnibus introduction points out that other stories across time have elements of mystery here and there, she argues that it's not until the 1800s that these stories started appearing on a regular basis. In fact, it was the mid-1800s, very suddenly. There's a very specific time frame that we can see where the genre started. She argues that it started with this at the same time that a rise in the belief in science and the scientific method happened. And she even goes on to argue that at the time of King James I, for example, the height of the era of witch hunts, you could not have had a mystery. Why not? Because the belief that an accusation of witchcraft automatically equals the guilt of witchcraft, the belief that torturing people to get a confession of their witchcraft is the way to go about figuring out who's really a witch, and believing that any one of your neighbors could change nature at any point in time just by making a deal with the devil, that creates a world in which observation, reasoning, patterns, none of those have anything to do with discovering truth. So we have to have the detective stories have to wait until science starts to become a better way of understanding the world. And the genre itself started between the publication of Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle and The Origin of Species. I want you to look at the slide in case you haven't been. In 1839, Darwin publishes Voyage of the Beagle. 2 years later, the story that is considered the first modern mystery story, Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, is published. Over the next few years, he publishes several murder stories, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Mystery of Marie Roget, The Purloined Letter, Thou Art the Man, and The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. Now, at that point, Poe stops writing murder mysteries. But Darwin's The Origin of Species is published in 1859. And at that time, other people have started picking up where Poe left off. What's fascinating is Poe set in these 5 stories many things that we still think of as, well, that's just typical of mystery stories today. So we're going to look at what they are. Poe's mysteries introduced the idea of the wrongly suspected person, the sealed room, that how could there be a dead body in this room and nobody else there? This room has been sealed, but clearly that person didn't do that to themselves. The innocent person who's arrested. Think of the mysteries you've watched. How many times does an innocent person get blamed? How many times is it that the sleuth is actually trying to get somebody off the hook by finding the person who really did it? The solution by unexpected means. Whoa, we weren't expecting that. For those of you who have read or not read The Murder in the Rue Morgue, it turns out that the murders were caused by an ape that climbed in through a window. Okay. Pairing of the sleuth with a not as bright friend. Throughout the history of this genre, you get these friendships. There's a sleuth who does all the solving of the problems. He's got this friend who's there's a sidekick. That friend does some really important things. The biggest one is he asks the questions that the reader needs to know the answers to. He also tends to not be quite as bright as the average reader, so he gives that reader a little bit of a boost. Ooh, I got that, when the sleuth sidekick did not. Some of these pairings include really famous ones you've heard of: Sherlock Holmes and Watson, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. Batman and Robin are even this kind of detective. Now, if you're going, wait a minute, Batman's a detective, there are several of the Batman bad guys who call him a detective. And DC Comics literally stood for, at the time when it started, Detective Comics. Batman and Robin were the detective and not as bright sidekick when they started. Psychological deduction came out of Poe's mysteries. Obvious hiding places for things that somebody hides something in plain sight. For some reason, throughout the history of mystery, people still fall for that one. False clues. And the most unlikely person that it could possibly be is the guilty party. You also get occasionally in mysteries today that cipher, that code that is dropped by somebody or left somewhere or sent by someone and gets intercepted by someone else. The code that gives you the clue as soon as you can break it tells you something about what's going on. Now, while Poe only wrote 5 of these sorts of stories, he influenced 2 other writers, especially. There were several people, Wilkie Collins and a few others, who started writing mysteries, but there were 2 others who decided to try their hand at this that are considered very important steps in the history of mystery. One is Charles Dickens, best known for A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist. The last book he wrote, the book he was working on when he died, was The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Part of the mystery is nobody knows how he was going to finish the story. It was left unfinished. And the other one was Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this was all the way later in 1893. And Sherlock Holmes took such a stronghold on the cultural psyche that not only did it spur countless imitators, but his stories are still being retold today. Maybe you've seen the BBC Sherlock Holmes series that was just being aired recently. Maybe the recent Sherlock Holmes movies with Jude Law, I hope it was Jude Law, if it's not, you guys will tell me, as Sherlock Holmes. They get told over and over and over again. Sometimes they get added to. Sometimes there are interesting changes that are made to them. There have even been spin-offs. I've seen some books now about Sherlock Holmes's younger sister who's now solving mysteries. But these stories that were influenced by Poe and Holmes reached their peak in what is commonly called the Golden Age of Mystery. It's the 1920s and the 1930s, the era between World War I and World War II. It could be argued that these stories gained popularity because in some ways, the experience of reading the mystery was a microcosm of what everybody lived through during the war. Pre-war life appeared in retrospect to be idyllic. Then this war came and shattered everything. Everybody knew people who died in that war. The war changed the world permanently. But it was the war to end all wars, right? That's what they called it for a couple decades. And so now the fear and the terror of the young people you know dying in war, it's over. Everything's better. The world's going to be a better place. Everything's solved. We can go back to living our lives. For this audience, the stories may have served what Aristotle called a cathartic purpose, working through their own emotions through the engagement in a story. But while all this information may help us understand mystery better, so far, I have not said anything to suggest that this genre is of particular value to Christian readers. By the way, I have gotten a text informing me that Jude Law is Watson. I was halfway there, and Robert Downing Jr. is Holmes. Thank you. So I've told you a little bit about the history of the genre. I got us to this point that I wanted to get us to. We're now going to talk about no, we're not. We're now going to talk a little bit more about some general things that show up in the genre that at least reflect Christian values or Christian thoughts. According to Sayers, again, the mystery genre can only work if the writer and reader share a strong understanding of the concept of sin. If you do not believe that sin exists, and you do not believe that sin has serious consequences, both for the sinner and the person sinned against, then there's no reason to continue reading a mystery story. So what if somebody got killed? It is what it is. It becomes the thing that some people have accused it of being, that story that, in which life has no value. You just have a corpse there. Oh, well, move on. But they don't move on. Instead, there is a moral code. There is a standard of what is believed to be acceptable or not acceptable behavior. There is a concept of sin that shapes the genre. Now, the reader and the writer may actually disagree on exactly what actions are sins, but they're not going to disagree that murder is a sin. It's the one that they're going to agree on, as we generally do. And I think we can argue that the concept itself of sin shapes the genre. Therefore, it reinforces the belief in the seriousness of sin. Therefore, we can agree that at least in that way, these stories are tied into a Christian concept. Now, as we've already mentioned, the mystery story always begins in a place that is peaceful and or tranquil. That peace is shattered by a horrific crime. Someone, generally from outside the immediate community, comes in and solves the crime. In an essay called In Defense of Detective Fiction, G.K. Chesterton describes this character as a modern-day knight in shining armor. Back to Batman, the Dark Knight. He's a knight in shining armor. Okay, knight in dark armor, but still, it's that same concept that the detective is also the knight, who represents not only the law, but absolute morality. For the story to work, the reader, wait a second. So the knight represents the law, represents absolute morality. For the story to work, the reader not only has to have the concept of sin, but must have some idea of the good that stands against sin. It's not just that evil exists and it's dark and powerful and out there, but there is good that stands against it. That good is what is just, what is right, what is pure. The sleuth steps in as the representative of all that is good and upright. Again, that does not mean that the sleuth is always going to have a set of Christian morals, but they are standing for what, at least in the context of that story, is the good. And they do have, that sleuth will have a strong moral code. So the sleuth solves the crime. At this point, many of those who write about the genre finish the description with phrases like, he solves the crime, thus restoring the original peace. But that almost never actually happens in these stories. What really happens is that through the interference of this outsider, everyone, not just the victim and the murderer, everyone's secret sins are exposed. As each person comes into the spotlight of that good and moral person who's trying to bring out what is true about the situation, their sins become exposed. Even if each person whose sins are exposed had nothing to do with the murder, they have things that they have to deal with in their lives that need to be fixed. And now everybody knows it. At the end of the story, everyone who's left alive will still have to face the consequences of their sin. If the mystery genre were to have a theme verse, it is Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sins will find you out. Now, not only is the mystery genre based on a belief that sin is real, it is also based in the idea that when someone has been sinned against, they deserve justice. Specifically, the mystery genre reinforces the type of justice set forth in Exodus 21:23-25. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, during the golden age of mystery, the law that these stories are written in the context of required that murderers be hanged. So as a general rule, the good sleuth who has done his job isn't just exposing evil, they're setting up the murderer to get their just reward, their eye for an eye, their tooth for a tooth. This is the justice that was served. In other words, the general attitudes about sin and justice presented in this genre are not just biblical, but they are based in Old Testament law. It is the Old Testament that shapes the traditional mystery novel. But there's more to this. While these are the general ideas that shape the genre as a whole, more needs to be said about the relationship between mystery and Christianity. So we're going to say some of it. Okay, back to the golden age of mystery. Thinking more about the relationship between mystery and Christianity starts when we look at the three most popular and influential mystery writers of the golden age. They were Dorothy Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, Agatha Christie. These three writers were Christians. Dorothy Sayers is the creator of the Lord Peter Wimsey Mysteries, which has been serialized as miniseries on BBC twice now. G.K. Chester, two different sets of series. G.K. Chesterton, the creator of the Father Brown series, which is currently being made a series on BBC. It is in season 9 has been released. I just found out today that season 10 is slated to come out in January of 2023, those of you who get BBC America. And Chesterton also he added some of the elements that are considered common parts of the genre today. And Agatha Christie, the creator of several detective novels, including Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, Tommy and Tuppence, so different series that she does. There's some others. She also has the distinction of being one of the best-selling writers of all time, beat out only by William Shakespeare and the Bible. These three writers were not only wildly popular writers at the Golden Age, but they are still read, dramatized today. But there's something else all three had in common. As I've said before, all three were Christians, and their faith both shapes and is present in their writing, including their murder mysteries. Now, it's no surprise to many fans of the genre that Sayers and Chesterton were Christian. After all, alongside of mysteries, they both wrote books and essays on Orthodox theology, as well as much as Sayers hated the term, apologetics. But Christie's faith comes as a surprise to many, even those who have read many of her books. So we're going to look a little closer at each of these writers and how their faith may be relevant to their writings. So the first one we're going to look at is G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton's faith is such that he has been described as the last true knight of the faith, a title he would have absolutely loved. He had a walking stick that had a sword inside it. He loved that idea. And one group of people is even currently trying to get him recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church. Don't hold your breath, guys. But that wasn't always the story of Chesterton. Born in the Victorian era to a family that was overall more interested in the ideas of Darwin than of any specific religion, he read the Bible as a child for the sheer glory of its stories. He loved the stories he found there. When he was taken to church, it was a Unitarian church. So his family's not particularly religious. His mother did decide to read to him and his brother a story about St. Francis at one point, because St. Francis was a good person who took care of the poor, not because of any particular religious part of the story. So it was a surprise to his family members when, as a young journalist gaining popularity across England for his book and art reviews, he became involved in a public debate about Christianity and declared, "I am a Christian." Later books, such as Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man, explained not only his belief that Christianity is the only way of thinking that explains the world we live in, but he also explains his journey to faith in the two books, Everlasting Man and Orthodoxy, which you can see that. On his journey, he moved from atheism to Anglicanism. Then near the end of his life, he went from Anglicanism and converted to Catholicism. On this journey, though, he always saw Christianity as the great story in the same category as the adventures of King Arthur and St. George. To Chesterton, Christianity is a romance. It's the truth that all fairy stories point to. You can even see in the picture here, the subtitle of the book, Orthodoxy, is The Romance of Faith. So that's his background. And you can see his faith in his Father Brown stories. They're influenced by the logic and the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. I know I butchered that pronunciation right in front of our theology professor. Shame on me. The logic, the careful thinking through step by step, piece by piece, in a text that is doing that very differently than most other medieval texts are what they're doing with thought. Some of the stories have been viewed by readers who are trying to figure out what he's doing with them. Some of them are actually viewed as parables. Some are described as allegories. He uses deductive instead of inductive reasoning and gives fair ground to original sin. He also, now, to be fair, Chesterton created other mystery stories, such as The Paradoxes of Mr. Pond, The Poet and the Lunatics. If you've not read those, they're wonderful. If you like Father Brown, you'll love these. His Brown stories are the best known, and many imitators, such as Focus on the Family's Father Gilbert series, have been published in the same vein. Now, there's several things that make the Father Brown stories stand out as mysteries. According to Dale Ahlquist in his essay, The Art of Murder, G.K. Chesterton and the Detective Story, Father Brown started the whole subgenre of the underdog detective. This is the story about the person that no one expects to be able to solve a crime based on first appearances. In his first story, The Blue Cross, Father Brown is presented as a naive, bumbling priest who doesn't even know enough to keep the secret the fact that he's walking around, traveling, carrying something incredibly expensive and rare. At the end of the story, however, it's revealed that what appeared to be bumbling behavior was actually quite deliberate. First, to draw the attention of the thief who wants to steal that very object, then to draw the attention of the police so that they will arrest the thief. Father Brown is frequently underestimated by those who assume that a priest would know nothing of crime or the world. But actually, the case is quite the opposite, because he sits in confessions every day and listens to people as they reveal their secret sins to no one but him. Father Brown has a much stronger understanding of sin and the darkness of the world than anyone around him, including the criminals he talks to. At the same time, however, Father Brown is actually less interested in justice being served than most detectives. He is instead much more concerned about the fate of the sinner's soul. His first adventure ends with his sitting down in a field having a discussion with a criminal, both dressed as priests, and they're talking about the relationship between rational thought, truth, and morality. Does morality exist? How can you come to understand what morality is? Is morality the same across the universe? Father Brown, of course, says, yes, it is. The other priest, of course, says, no, it's not. And that's how we figure out who the criminal is and who's the real priest. In another story, Father Brown actually catches a criminal. And the criminal says to him, I don't want to threaten you, as he's trying to get away. And Father Brown responds, I do want to threaten you with the worm that dieth not and the fire that is not quenched. He then tells this person, I'm a priest. I'm ready to hear your confession. This is for a different person than simply making sure that they caught the right person. Father Brown is much more interested in the immortal souls of each and every person involved in any mystery than he is in a more temporal justice. But that role of confession is limited. In one story, The Hammer of God, he actually refuses to hear someone's confession because he realizes that if he hears it, he will not be able to continue to work on solving the crime. It's a person who has confessed to the police that they did something, and Father Brown figures out that A, they didn't, and what he is going to hear is, in confession, this person's going to tell their priest that, oh, I lied to save somebody I love. So Father Brown, in that case, actually wants truth more than he wants a confession. As this demonstrates, many of the Father Brown mysteries include some sort of thought or discussion outright that happens there in the text of either Christian practice or theology as part of the solution to the mystery. So not only did Father Brown mysteries open the door for underdog detectives, but they also set the stage for a large number of later clergy detectives. Just a few examples include the American TV series Father Dowling that ran from the 1980s into the early 1990s, Charles Merrill Smith's Reverend Randolph books, or the Rabbi Small series by Harry Kimmelman. There are dozens others. Those are just a few of them. Now we could talk more about things that people have pointed out that Chesterton added to the genre, but we are trying to keep within a certain time frame. So we'll talk about the next author, the next of the three. Dorothy Sayers. Where Chesterton viewed faith as an adventure to undertake, and his story follows a simple trajectory, Dorothy Sayers' journey was much more complicated. When she was born, her father was the chaplain of Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. She was his only child. Later, he was the rector of a small country parish that had a large, comfortable house out in the country. One of her first publications was this remarkable collection of poems about Christ called Catholic Tales and Christian Songs. Each poem looks at Christ through a completely different lens, and some of them have been accused of being sacrilegious. Others have been accused of being above and beyond your usual devotional material. In this book, it's called Catholic Tales and Christian Songs. She is using the word Catholic in the larger sense of the whole instead of the name of one type of Christianity. Later, however, as she got older, she made some, we're going to call them poor decisions with life-changing consequences that do not fit into what is commonly called the Christian lifestyle. If you want to know more about that, there are dozens of biographers, at least a dozen biographers, who have explored this very much and come up with different reasons why and what she did and what it meant and so forth. Finally, though, after writing, so she does these things that have a definite negative effect on the rest of her life. After writing more than a dozen murder mysteries, she starts writing essays and a couple of books about theology. It seems like a very sudden change to a lot of biographers. One way that this has been interpreted is that, well, while she was in college, she walked away from the faith. She wrote mysteries while she was an agnostic. And then when she came back to the faith, she gave up mysteries and started writing theology and distinctly Christian drama. For example, one of the things she's best known for, besides her Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries, is a series of radio plays aired on the BBC called The Man Born to be King. They were highly controversial at the time because it was illegal in England for an actor to portray any member of the Holy Trinity on stage. And here they are on the radio having a whole series of radio plays about the life of Jesus, in which not only do they have a character acting out like he's Jesus, but they have him talking in vernacular instead of King James English. Shocking. They were highly controversial, but the controversy led many people to listen to the series who otherwise might not have. And many of those people wrote letters both to Sayers and to the BBC about how the plays helped them understand Christianity for the first time. Now, she also got letters from people who weren't as happy, including one person who wrote to her, "How can you call yourself an intelligent person and say that you believe in miracles?" She had another friend who she was good friends with for most of her life or adult life, and she would write back and forth, and they would get together for tea or coffee or whatever else at times. And that was C.S. Lewis. So she wrote to C.S. Lewis, just complaining, because, friends do that sometimes, complain to each other. Shocking, I know. Saying that there's this guy who's driving me crazy. He keeps writing me these letters and he won't leave me alone. He's trying to convert me to atheism. And somebody just needs to write a really good book about miracles for people today. So Dorothy Sayers, in that conversation, actually persuaded Lewis to write the book Miracles, which some of you may have read. So why did I get off topic on that? I apologize. Anyway, so people are writing to her, talking to her about how her writings have helped them understand Christianity. Some of them are writing to her because they feel the need to reach out and tell her she's wrong and keep telling her that, kind of like Facebook today, but much more detailed and slower. While this pattern of rebellion and conversion that many biographers have seen does make a great story, other biographers have pointed out that the story's not that simple. Even at her most apparently agnostic stage, she still appreciated church. And she, at the time when many biographers have said, well, she was an agnostic, that was when she was reading Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, which helped her keep her faith. And she talks, the rest of her life, talks about how Orthodoxy is one of the most important books she ever read. Even at what on the outside appeared to be her most solidly Christian stage, she would get angry with people who talked about her as some sort of model Christian. She knew she wasn't. She got frustrated with titles she was given, like people called her an evangelist because of some of what she had written. They called her an apologist. She did not like either of those titles. She became very close friends with other Christian writers. I've already mentioned C.S. Lewis, who actually, after she died, Lewis wrote a letter talking about what a good friend she had been, and he finished it with a statement that we must thank her creator for creating her. She also became friends with G.K. Chesterton, the person whose book had helped her when she was younger. They're both mystery writers. They end up in a club together. They become good friends. And another Christian writer who she was friends with was a guy named Charles Williams. Now, Williams was a good friend of C.S. Lewis's, and I know that those of you who've read some Williams, he's complicated, and there are different strong views people have about Charles Williams. But at one point, Williams challenged her to think about something that they were both struggling with. Both Williams and Sayers described their faith as something that was based in the conclusion that the Christian faith is the only way to make sense out of an otherwise senseless world, kind of like what Chesterton had said earlier. Both had come to these conclusions on different paths, but the faith that they ultimately reached was one of intellectual acquiescence, followed by attempts to live in a way that was consistent with the faith. Neither of them had a dramatic emotional conversion experience. Neither of them had had strong emotions connected with their faith at all. Williams was concerned that this may not be enough. It might not really make you a Christian to agree with the faith and try to follow it. Sayers argued that when your faith is based in intellectual consent instead of emotion, you will never mistake feeling emotional over the wounds of Christ for the actual work of dying to yourself, the work that we are called to do. We're called to obey. We are not called to feel. Their mutual friend, C.S. Lewis, would have responded and did respond in another way. He said that Christ is humble enough to accept us even on our own terms, the way that we can understand him, partly because of the personality we have. Even with all of this, it's easy for some to dismiss the fiction of Sayers as pre-Christian, her other writings as Christian. So let's talk a little more about the Lord Peter books. In the beginning, Lord Peter Wimsey is an absolute fop. He solves crimes for fun. For example, in the first book, Whose Body, when he finds out that a respectable household has found a dead body of nobody they know in their bathtub, he sings, "We both have got a body in our bath," and describes the incident as, oh, very good. He does, however, have a more serious side. He suffers from what today is called PTSD, and we learn that he took up detecting to try to get his mind off the war that haunts him. This character Wimsey also, throughout the series, we discover that he has a lot of friends who are Christians. He employs a woman named Miss Clemson to help him solve crimes and to run a typing service. Amazing. She's a devout Catholic. Parker, his best friend next to his valet who fought alongside of him in the war. Parker is a policeman who reads biblical commentaries for fun. He reads biblical commentaries because, as a policeman, he has to believe in order. He has to believe in goodness and right and justice. So he wants to understand the Bible better. One of Lord Peter Wimsey's associates is a former lockpick who is now a pastor of an evangelical church. How did that happen? Well, Peter Wimsey caught him trying to break into his apartment, and for the sheer fun of it, decided, I'm going to convert him, and succeeds. Not because Peter believes in Christianity, because he's kind of crazy. Wimsey's not a Christian. He makes that clear over and over and over again. He has the form of faith. He knows Bible stories and cites them all the time. He can quote scripture. He even visits churches because he likes the music, but he is not a person of faith himself. Over time, though, and as the series progresses, Peter grows as a person, and he changes from this careless person who kind of drives you crazy, even though he's ridiculous and you kind of have to keep reading to see what he's going to do. He changes into someone who cares deeply about others. He has integrity and depth by the end of the series, even though he still struggles with his PTSD. C.S. Lewis described the series as possibly the only set of murder mysteries in which the sleuth actually grows and develops into a real person. Others describe it as the best mystery series of its time because of how the main character changes little by little, bit by bit, book by book. Near the end of the series, Peter acknowledges that even though he himself is not a Christian, there is something in scripture that he cannot argue against. It's the statement about how Christ came to not bring peace, but a sword. It's an odd detail of scripture for that character to acknowledge, but it is a forward movement in his own story. The next book, the last book in the series, Busman's Honeymoon, reveals possibly the most interesting piece of information about this character. He gets married, his new wife and he are talking, and then I apologize. She isn't talking to him. She's talking to the servant Bunter. And she learns that every time that Peter solves a murder, he then asks the murderer for their forgiveness and handing them over to justice. The forgiveness is rarely given. They are people who've already committed a murder. You can understand why they're not too happy about getting caught. Peter struggles with this. Near the end of the story, he's asked to read scripture in church, and his wife observes that he stumbles over the words. It seems like this person who's normally so smooth is suddenly caught by the words he's reading. They mean something more than just the tradition. The story does not end with Peter's conversion. Instead, it ends with Peter and Harriet, his wife, sitting by the fire, waiting together for the dawn that to Peter means that his own latest victim will die. Peter knows that he needs forgiveness. He is not turned yet to the one place where he's been told more than once in the series that he can find it. But for now, having someone beside him suffering through this is better than suffering alone. He's on a journey. Dorothy Sayers doesn't finish that journey for the readers. A more straightforward way that you might think about how Sayers' faith is at work in her fiction is that throughout her mysteries, more than once, the reader is tipped off to the identity of the criminal because the murderer will give some sort of a statement or even lecture about how morals don't exist. There's no such thing as right and wrong, or they think there are no consequences for certain types of behavior because there is no God. Sorry if I just gave this away to those of you who may not have read all of Dorothy Sayers' books yet, but yeah, if you see a character who says those things, they're going to be guilty later. Kind of like if you've ever watched the Inspector Lewis and the Inspector Morse series, if you see someone that Inspector Morse starts to like, she's going to be somehow involved in the crime. Oh, did I give that away too? I apologize. I'm terrible. In fact, one of Dorothy Sayers' criminals even wrote a book about how the concept of right and wrong is really just specific chemicals firing in people's brains. It doesn't really mean anything. The faith Dorothy Sayers has a complicated relationship to her fiction. And she may have had a complicated relationship to faith, or a complicated faith itself, but she feels clearly that her readers should always recognize right and wrong, and the sense of right and wrong as a clue to what is going on in her characters' stories. So that's Sayers. The third and last one we're going to talk about is Agatha Christie, where Sayers' faith journey is complicated and Chesterton's is adventuresome. Christie's is comparatively simple. As one of the best-selling authors of all time, one might think her own beliefs would be better known. After all, if you know anything about the story of Agatha Christie, there's a couple things you probably know well. You probably know that when she discovered that her husband was having an affair, she disappeared for quite a few days and nobody knows what happened. It's not quite true that nobody knows what happened, but that's been the story. There have been movies based on what may have happened. There have been novels based on what may have happened. There have been documentaries. I've watched 3 of them in the last few weeks about what may have happened to Agatha Christie when she disappeared after her husband had the affair. It's actually more simple than it sounded. But if that small time period, just more than a week of her life, has made such huge news, how is it that her faith, what she believed in, has not? Part of it is, or has been said by some of her novelists, that it's just so, her faith was so natural to her that it was never something that she fought through the way Chesterton and Sayers did. She was christened as an infant in the Church of England. She grew up in a family that did not believe children should go to church until they were quite old enough to sit still. She describes this in her autobiography. "When can I go to church?" had been my constant demand. At last, the great day came. I sat next to my father in a pew near the front and followed the service in his big prayer book. He had told me beforehand that I could go out before the sermon if I liked. And when the time came, he whispered to me, "Would you like to go?" I shook my head vigorously and so remained. I enjoyed church services on Sunday very much. At home previously, there had been special storybooks only allowed to be read on Sundays, which made a treat of them, and books of Bible stories with which I was familiar. There is no doubt that the stories of the Old Testament are, from a child's point of view, rattling good yarns. She also talks in her autobiography about how when she was a child, she was very concerned for a while that her dad was going to hell because of certain things he did. She was very concerned that her mom wasn't going to be in heaven at one point. And she talks a little bit about how as she grew older, she came to understand some of those things much better, but she doesn't spend a lot of time on it. Other things that we see about her faith in action is smaller details. Multiple people who knew her mentioned that wherever she was, she had the book, The Imitation of Christ, sitting on the bedside, on the table beside her bed. Kept it there, would read it if she couldn't sleep. One of her detectives, Miss Jane Marple, does the same thing. In her later autobiographical book, Come Tell Me How You Live, it's a story of her early adventures with her second husband, who was the archaeologist Max Mallowan, who's written a whole bunch of books about archaeology and ancient Nimrod and things like that. She occasionally points out in this book that being at archaeological digs in the middle of the Middle East definitely made her think about biblical passages. But she does this in a quiet, unobtrusive way. She just drops it into the middle of the story about what else is going on, as though it's as natural as breathing. It was really not the focus of the book. An apparent simplicity of faith does not, however, mean that the faith has not been tried or has not gone through difficult situations. As I mentioned before, her first husband left her for another woman. A few years later, she remarried, and the Church of England priest declared that because she had remarried, she was no longer allowed to take communion in the Anglican Church. She did not argue, but meekly continued to attend that church with that priest, staying in her pew while the others went up for communion. In her autobiography, she has this to say about the Christian life. Every one of you will pass through a time when you will face despair. If you never face despair, you will never have become a Christian or known a Christian life. To be a Christian, you must face and accept the life that Christ faced and lived. You must enjoy things as he enjoyed things, be as happy as he was at the marriage at Cana, know the peace and happiness that it means to be at harmony with God and with God's will. But you must also know, as he did, what it means to be alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, to feel that all your friends have forsaken you, that those you love and trust have turned away from you, and that God himself has forsaken you. Hold on then to the belief that is not the end. If you love, you will suffer. And if you do not love, you do not know the meaning of a Christian life. When compared to her faith, or to her friend and colleague Chesterton, Christie's faith rarely surfaces in her mysteries. This does not mean, however, that she could not write fiction that incorporates her faith. There are 6 books that she wrote under the pen name Mary Westmacott, and she wrote a collection of Christmas stories and poems called Star Over Bethlehem, which I would love to spend a whole class just on, or the whole lecture just on that. It's amazing what she does in it. Highly recommend you read it this Advent. These stories show otherwise. The Mary Westmacott novels have been described as romance novels, or as Gothic novels, or as Gothic romance novels in the same vein as Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, but in each one of them, Christie tackles theological issues through conversations, through symbol, through events that happen to people. For example, the one that might be the most obvious is the rose and the yew tree. There's this young man who he's angry, he hates the world. He sees this young woman who has been all of her life, she's known that her job is to marry a certain guy. When he comes, she will marry him. She's happy, she's sweet, she's good, everybody loves her. He convinces her to run away with him. When they live somewhere else, he forces her to live in squalor. He does everything he can to degrade her, to demean her. He does not see her as a human being. He sees her as the object of everything he hates about the world, or as a symbol of everything he hates about the world. He makes her the object of his anger. A mutual friend tracks them down and tries to get her to leave him, but she simply says she can't because she loves him. Ultimately, because this guy is not a good person, someone attempts to take his life. She dives between him and the bullet, dying to save him. Now, this later becomes a common trope in television and movies. It's thought by some that it may have started here. But even though he despised her, she loved him so much, she died for him. Realizing that his life was bought with her blood, he turns around and becomes a very good person because he believes he owes it to her. It's what she would have done. It's what she would have liked to have seen if she had lived. When he dies, people at the end of the story, people call him a saint. This is, of course, the Christian story. Christ loves us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. As people bought with his blood, we are to live the way he would want us to, dying to our old selves and putting on his nature. While none of her mysteries are that straightforward, Christie's sleuths, whether the harmless-looking Miss Marple, who keeps the imitation of Christ by her bed, or the little Belgian Hercule Poirot, who was quite proud both of his little gray cells and his mustache, there is subtle evidence of their own faith at work. Poirot mentions once that he was born a Catholic, and various stories mention in passing that he attends church. Maybe he's leaving church when something happens, or he was gone to church when something happened. He solves mysteries because he believes that some things are always right, and others are, by the decree of God, always wrong. It feels natural that in multiple film adaptations, Poirot has been shown praying. In one, he even is shown praying through prayer, the rosary. The books never show this. Miss Marple, as we've already stated, keeps the imitation of Christ by her bed. She often solves mysteries not simply by observation, but also because of her belief in original sin. Her belief in original sin leads her to distrust everyone. But her distrust is framed in this quite charming manner, so that most people end up finding themselves really liking her, unless they have something to hide. That's another clue. If you're reading a Miss Marple book and somebody really doesn't like Miss Marple, never mind. don't want to give away too much. Ultimately, then, the genre of mystery is shaped by the beliefs of its most influential authors, who were themselves strong Christians who upheld a belief in the importance of what is good, what is pure, and what is right, and wrote stories that demonstrated the importance of these things. It does this through telling stories in which sin is treated as real with serious consequences. The Christian writers of the Golden Age presented a world in which both justice and forgiveness are needed for people to be able to move forward, a strange dichotomy at the heart of the Christian faith. And if you're not convinced by this argument, then I hope you can at least say something that has appeared in many mystery novels written by many people, especially in the Golden Era. And that is this. This has been a most entertaining evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. All right. Wow. There's a lot there. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
One person has said thank you, so that's good. We'll start with the some of the easier ones. Although I don't know if there's any baffling questions here. A comment from one attendee. Although not a murder mystery, The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe is a terrific example of deduction. I don't know if I've read enough Poe to comment on that. You got some more thanks. You have a thank you from Canada.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Canada, for attending this evening. A local observer has asked about the Doctor Who episode entitled "The Unicorn, and the Wasp."
Yes.
That's with, and then Agatha Christie as a character. I have no idea. I've not seen that. Have you seen
Yes.
that at all? Or
it's a lot of fun. It actually focuses on that part of it. It builds up to, now wait a minute. It's been a while since I've seen it. I know that in that episode, the main characters find Agatha Christie's car, which is one of the things that people found when she had disappeared and were concerned. Several people were convinced her husband had killed her. So yeah, I need to rewatch that. That was fun. I remember parts of it. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. I have that on DVD. I may have to watch it tonight before I go to bed.
No worries. Someone else had commented that everything they know about Agatha Christie, has come from that particular Doctor Who episode. Well, there's just a lot here, and I'm still trying to absorb all of this. I loved it, and I find it fascinating that modern mystery as a genre came about in part due to the development of science and observation and reason. Not that there hadn't been reason long before observation. So this is more of a random question. Yeah, how do I ask this? Well, like this. Here we go. Sorry, I'm extremely tired. So if this doesn't come out as coherent, what do you think these authors, and I'm talking about Sayers, Chesterton, and Christie, what would you think their reasons would be for writing this kind of genre if they were asked point blank, why this genre?
That's an excellent question. Chesterton always answered it by saying, because it makes money. The story he gave people, which you don't always know if it's true or not, but the story he gave people was that he decided to write detective fiction at a point in his life when he was very low on money. So he went into an editor and said, "What's selling right now? What kind of stories would you buy right now?" And they said, "Murder mystery." So according to the story, he sat down right there with a pad of paper that they gave him and a pencil and wrote out The Blue Cross, the first Father Brown mystery, before leaving. So that's Chesterton's story.
Okay.
I think Chesterton also very much, I mean, it's very clear that he deliberately tries to engage theological concepts in the Father Brown stories. So I think
Okay.
there's more to it than just that,
Mhm.
even in that very first one. Sayers, it's harder to know. She talks about in an essay that I can't think of the name of right now. If I think of it, I'll let you guys know. She talks about how she invented Peter Wimsey at a time in her life when she was no longer in college. She was trying to figure out who she's supposed to be and what she's supposed to do. Life was complicated and she didn't have a lot of money. So Peter Wimsey, she was writing this mystery and she created the character to by and large be everything she wished she had. So she didn't have a car, so she gives him the best car she knew of. She has a horrible apartment that doesn't even have warm water, so she gives him a really expensive apartment in this really expensive area in England. But then she can't make him too perfect, right? Because nobody would like that person. So she makes him someone who struggles with PTSD. He has nightmares. He has times when he breaks down and cannot solve the mystery. Or even at one time in one of the mysteries, he's actually he solves it and somebody's talking to him while he's sitting there in a dressing gown because he can't function. And he says, by the way, did you figure this out? So she's her reasons for doing things are always more complicated than other people's. She's an interesting one. Agatha Christie actually wrote her first mystery because her sister basically dared her to. And I think her sister thought she wouldn't do it. And she did. It was called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And it sold so well that she's like, well, I'm going to do that again. And she became the person we know of today.
That's fast. Well, thank you. It's fascinating. So pragmatism and a bet. And I was looking for some maybe like really deep. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, but I actually that like just makes us all the more charming, I think. Another question: any contemporary murder mysteries by Christians of a good literary quality?
Oh, that's an interesting statement. I know that Christian publishers are currently publishing murder mysteries. I know that because on October 8th, I was at the Evangelical Church Librarian Association's conference where somebody from Baker comes and goes through a list every year. They go through a list of what's been published in the last year that's Christian fiction that they think is good. And quite a few of them this year were mysteries. I'm going to give that a caveat that I didn't listen that closely because I don't always listen that closely to that speaker, even though she's a great person. She's going through books that I don't necessarily read. Am I putting down Christian publishing? No, but I don't know as much about it as I probably should. If you want to ask me about Christian children's mysteries that were published in the 1980s and 90s, I can talk to you about those for hours on end. But yeah. I know that there are some Episcopalians who are publishing in the not religious publishing realm. I would have to go. I know that's a great way to list them. Episcopalians, in general, Todd, right?
All right. That's all right. Yeah.
I would have to go look at who they are. I know that they are on lists of people I should be reading and I'm not reading. If anybody wants to throw out any that they know, that would be great.
Yeah. I will read them.
Emily has actually thrown out in chat, I think, something that might be good for people to look at.
Not sure if Louise Penny might be an author worth reading. Definitely Christian ideas in her Inspector. Is it Gamache? I may be pronouncing that. Or See How They Run, which works with Agatha Christie's Mousetrap. I am literally just reading what I'm seeing here in the comment section without having clue what any of these books are. But for what it's worth, these are titles worth checking out. One quick question here. Someone else has commented, Terry Blackstock and Ted Decker with 2 Ks are possibilities as well. And we've got an interesting question here. Do you have any comments on some of the more current movies like Clue or Knives Out? Yeah.
That's a very general question. They were both fun to watch. Would I call them distinctly Christian stories? Well, No. Would I say Christians shouldn't be watching them? No. Clue is really fun. When it was in the theaters, he's the person who said that said recently, it was in the theaters when I was in high school. So it's been a few years.
Ooh.
But if you see the DVD release, when it was in the theaters, they had 4 different endings or 3 different endings, and which ending you saw depended on which theater you went to. It was a gimmick to get people to see the movie more than once and go to different theaters. If you get the DVD release, they show the whole story and then says, well, that might be how it happened, or maybe it happened this way. And then they go back to the point where they diverge and starts it over again. Then it does the same thing. And finally at the end, it says, but this is how it really happened. It's funny. It's interesting that they play with it that way, that they deliberately lead their audience on with different endings. I don't know that I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of things was the person was asking about. Knives Out is a very different kind of story. Knives Out is what I would call a postmodern murder mystery. And I really can't explain why, because that gives way too much away.
That's okay. I think I suspect it's more along the lines of the genre of some other murder mysteries, perhaps, that are on offer in film today. And I know that's a huge issue.
I would say,
yeah.
Can I add? I would say that it might be fair to say that it is deliberately challenging some of the tropes in murder mystery.
Okay. Yeah, another commenter has said Knives Out is one of the best movies they've seen in a very long time. They could watch it again and again. So
definitely some very funny elements and some very dark elements.
Well, thank you again for a wonderful talk, and just jam-packed with wonderful information and a lot of things to think about. I just to respect everybody's time and for this evening, unless we've got any more questions. I don't think so. If you have any other comment you want to make in closing us out, Melody, that's your call. You're welcome to do so.
I think I saw one question. I'm going to go see if it's there or not, and if I was just imagining it. Somebody said, I heard Christy and Sayers had a complicated relationship. Was it a positive one?
Oh, I missed that one. Yeah, I certainly. Well, thank you. You're doing my job better than me.
That's okay. It just happened to pop up on the screen. Not all of them did. So you did a great job of tracking them. That's an interesting statement. I would say that sometimes when you hear people talking about authors saying that, or talking about anybody in the past really saying, they clearly had a complicated relationship. Sometimes what people are doing is taking one sentence in one letter and basing a whole theory about a relationship on it. From what I understand, the person who has said that, and then other people have run with it, was basing the statement on, and I may be wrong, if you know more than this, please let me know. If you heard it differently, please let me know. But was basing the statement on, so Dorothy Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, and Agatha Christie were founding members of this organization called the Detection Club, which is something that's delightful and bizarre. And there's actually a document at the Wade Center in Wheaton College that they all signed with a bunch of other people about these are the rules for the Detection Club. It's only writers of detective mysteries. When it was clear that Dorothy Sayers wasn't going to be writing any more mysteries in the near future, Agatha Christie basically said, well, that sucks. That's a bad idea. And wasn't happy with Sayers for giving up the genre. But I don't know that that means that they had a complicated relationship. I mean, we can all think something a friend of ours did is a dumb idea. And we can all express that without necessarily having that long-term effect. Now, if there's more to what that person who asked that question has heard or said, I would like to know more about what they've heard. So I think really it's Now, there is one other thing that could be part of what they heard as well. At the end of at the end of Dorothy Sayers' life, her friends learned something that she had kept a secret her entire life. I'm not going to say what it is right now, simply because that explodes a whole new conversation. Some of them felt hurt that she didn't trust them, but that literally happened after she died. Some of them were actually relieved to know, oh, that's what was going on and what didn't make sense. So it could be that somebody also, or put that with the earlier letter, or also blew that up a little bit. But that is, again, it was a very interesting question. I think it's a really interesting way that people, it's just an example of a really interesting way that people will read one thing in somebody's life and assume that it is a huge thing. Part of what I'm referring to is there's a lot of people who have talked a lot about Tolkien and Lewis not getting along very well after a certain point. And it's like, actually, there's a lot of evidence that Humphrey Carpenter made that up for the book, The Inklings. And people who knew them at the times when he said they weren't getting along tell a very different story than Humphrey Carpenter does. But that, because it was in the first biography of, the whole group, The Inklings, that has become canonical thought instead of what probably really was much more normal, much more of what was really happening. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I appreciate this. I'm sorry to hold you over a little bit.
No worries. No worries.
So much fun.
We're always on a loose time schedule.
They had wonderful questions.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, again, for attending. And I think at some point we will have these uploaded onto our website, although I say that with fear and trepidation. God bless you all. Have a great fall, and we hope to see you this spring.
Thank you, everyone.